In the first 20 years of my practice as a therapist, I can count on one hand, so we're talking 5 people or so, that identified political stress as one of the main reasons that they were talking with me as their therapist, right? 20 years, about 5 people, okay? In the last week, I completed about 30 appointments. And of those 30 appointments, 15 of those people identified political stress as one of the main issues, if not the main issue, that they were talking with me. Welcome to Wellness with John. I'm John Peters, and these are resources to help you thrive. So in this episode, I want to talk a little bit about political stress, but let me preface this by saying this is not me giving some sort of ideological polemic. I'm not preaching be a Democrat, be a Republican, be a democratic socialist, whatever. I know that political topics are hot topics and people generally want to avoid them, but this has become the elephant in the room for us therapists, and we really can't avoid it, right? Let me put this in a little perspective. In the first 20 years of my practice as a therapist, I can count on one hand, so we're talking 5 people or so, that identified political stress as one of the main reasons that they were talking with me as their therapist, right? 20 years, about 5 people, okay? In the last week, I completed about 30 appointments. And of those 30 appointments, 15 of those people identified political stress as one of the main issues, if not the main issue, that they were talking with me. So in the first 20 years of my practice, I completed about 20,000 appointments probably, and had only 5 people identify that. In the last week, 50%, half, right? If it had been the same in my first 20 years, that would have been 10,000 appointments where people talked about that, right? We're talking about an astronomical increase in the pervasiveness of people identifying political stress as negatively impacting their mental health to the point where they need to talk to the therapist about it, right? Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of analyzing our current political mess in the United States or my thoughts about particular ways that ought to change and improve. But I wanted to make this video, and I'm probably going to make others because this is going to continue to be a topic of focus. But I wanted to make this video to talk about one aspect of coping with political stress, right? And I thought of making the video recently because one of the people I was talking with, actually 2 or 3 different people have said a version of this recently. But I was talking with a client who was saying that, recent stress triggered by unfolding events in the federal government in the United States were stressing them out. And one of the things that this person does is bake bread. And they mentioned that they were actually baking more bread than normal. But here's the interesting point, and the reason I'm making this video. When my client talked about both being stressed and doing more baking, they implied this confusion about whether the baking was even proper. Because if you're like my client and like me, part of the struggle that we deal with is balancing being reasonably informed with also trying to not be overwhelmed with stress from the information that we're exposing ourselves to, right? So if you have watched my other videos on the channel, you know that I'm not a fan of being apathetic and burying our heads in the sand. My personal moral stance toward ethics is that to be good citizens, we have to be reasonably informed and reasonably engaged to do our part to help support a civil society. That's just my stance, And so I don't think just burying our heads in the sand and fleeing is the answer for responding to being stressed out about political issues, right? However, I do firmly believe that we have to balance being aware and somehow open to taking in information about current events, things that may matter to us in our lives or that matter to people in general for whom we have empathy. We have to balance that with being overwhelmed, because the reality is that in mere minutes, you can expose yourself to news stories via the television, the radio, online, that trigger your stress reaction, but may not be things that you can easily and readily cope with. So you can just overload yourself with too much triggering stuff, right? And part of the reason for this is that humans evolved in a setting where a lot of the things, a good percentage of the things that troubled us were also things that we could respond to, right? I'm hungry, I'll go forage for food. That bear is chasing me, I can run from the bear or fight the bear, okay? So we encountered stressors, but a significant percentage of the stressors were things that we could meaningfully respond to. Thus, we didn't feel helpless, victimized, and out of control. But what many of my clients say to me, and what I'm already familiar with, and this was a big issue back in 2020 during the pandemic and the onset of the war in Ukraine and the riots and things like that. We can so easily, in a few minutes, see these troubling news stories and not immediately have some sort of sense of being able to immediately respond meaningfully in some way that we might have some sort of positive influence on them. So you just can't load up too many of those per day and avoid feeling powerless. So again, it's not a recipe for burying your head in the sand in order to protect yourself from feeling overwhelmed. But I do think you have to be careful about how open you are, or maybe even the timing of what portion of the day do you listen to the news in, things like that. And so why am I talking about bread? So back to that point, when I was having this conversation with this patient, and I've had similar conversations with others, there's this ambivalence about, well, maybe engaging in bread making or exercise or working a puzzle or taking a walk in the woods, maybe that represents that burying the head in the sand kind of flight. Therefore, it's unacceptable, right? So if you say, it's not okay for me to abdicate my responsibility to being a good citizen, then to the extent that I run from the information, run from that experience of engagement, maybe I'm not being fully responsible and fully engaged in a way that I think is proper. If that were true, and if all activities other than watching the news and taking direct action represented that flight from responsibility, then yes, bread making, working puzzles, taking a walk in the woods, and all that might be seen as bad, okay? However, let's imagine a scenario where a person neglects the things in their life that provide them stability, whether it's baking bread or doing yoga or taking a walk in the woods or whatever it might be. Let's imagine that in the interest of maximum involvement in responses to social and political and environmental issues, the person says, I don't have time for those things. That person is going to become less grounded. That person is going to become more unwell mentally and physically. That person is consequently going to be less able to stay grounded for these issues that are persistent, right? A lot of these issues that people are getting stressed about today and that you might be stressed about, no matter what we do, we can't solve them today. They're going to persist. Part of your responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your communities, to society, is to not fall apart. You need to stay grounded. You need to stay mentally and physically healthy. And therefore, I argue that these activities actually contribute to being a well person, a whole person, a good citizen. Because if everybody falls apart, then society falls apart. Society has to be made up of a sufficient number of individuals who are sufficiently stable and mentally and physically well to make the thing run however we're choosing to run it. And so that's why I titled this video Bread Making as a Political Act, because I think that it is important for us to divine what things we need to engage in that may not seem directly related to some sort of response to the issues, but that if we look deeply enough, and we don't have to look too long and too deep to see that our life is a big, amalgam of a lot of elements. And those things that keep us sane, keep us grounded, are integral to our being able to stay well enough to continue to engage in meaningful ways with the things that we think are important and toward the goals that we think are important, and to stay in the game and to continue to negotiate and collaborate and to cooperate and push for having a civil society in the fashion that we think is right. Now, this is not an excuse, again, to go overboard and to actually flee. Because as I said, I do think we have to be reasonably engaged. But on the practical level, there's some things that don't seem directly connected to the thing that may be essential. Not just important, but essential, right? There's a story that Thich Nhat Hanh told one time when his organization that was helping displaced people in Southeast Asia, they were tasked to help with hundreds of boat people who were being told to leave the harbor of Singapore and go into international waters, and they had nowhere to go. And Thich Nhat Hanh tells a story of how the first thing that he did before he went to the meeting to discuss the strategy of how to help these people on these boats is he did 20 minutes of walking meditation. And you could argue, hey, wait, you shouldn't go do anything. You should just rush to the meeting, sit down and figure out a solution, because these people literally were given like 24 hours to get out of the port, right? It was very urgent. But Thich Nhat Hanh explained, if he didn't first do his 20 minutes of walking meditation, he wasn't going to probably show up at the meeting in a good state to be able to optimally contribute what he could contribute to help with the plan, right? So you are tasked to figure out what are the things that help you stay sane and grounded, and how can you optimally keep them in play so that you can stay sane and grounded and continue to be a good person, a good family member, a good citizen. This is what we all have to figure out how to do, right? Now, my practical advice, though, in trying to create that optimal balance is cut your intake of news down to the level daily that you can take in and you can reasonably cope with. And for some people, that's none right now for a bit. For some people, it's 10 minutes. But I guarantee if you're doom scrolling on social media for 3 hours a day, you're doing too much, right? If you're refreshing MSNBC or the news or whatever all day, every day on YouTube or wherever, it's going to be too much. So you got to throttle that in the short term to figure out how much can you take in, what kinds of things, which topics can you focus on, and stay relatively sane so that you don't fall apart. And figure out things that you can do, even if small, that help your brain have a sense of having some ability to not be completely out of control. That may mean having a direct local one-on-one relationship with a neighbor or a friend. It might mean calling your representative. It might mean doing some simple action, right? Is infinitely better than doing nothing and feeling out of control. So that's my advice with that. And stay tuned to the channel. I talk about a lot of therapy topics, and I am likely to talk again about this topic because it's of great importance to a lot of people I'm working with. And personally, I want to stay sane and grounded too. And I want us to craft a civil society and sustainable environmental policies as well. So that's where I'm coming from with this. Thanks for joining me today. If you like this kind of content, hit the like button below. If you're yet to subscribe to the channel, please subscribe. And if you know somebody that you think this message might be helpful to, then feel free to share it. Thanks.